I've always wanted to create a video discussing a visual novel scenario writer, covering their work's style and the pros and cons of their stories. In this video, I'll focus on a writer who has made a significant impression on me in recent years, Yukito Urushibara. I'll give a short primer on every title this writer has written so far, discussing his scenario writing style, including its strengths and weaknesses. The first full visual novel he wrote is Irotoridori no Sekai, often shortened to Iroseka, originally developed by Favorite. Released in Japan in 2011, it received an official English translation by Nekonion through its HD remaster in 2024. This visual novel follows Yuma Kanoe, an amnesiac boy with a special power, who partners with a translucent girl named Shinku, visible only to him. She grants him the ability to heal any living person at the cost of some of his memories. While the game starts with a typical Moe-style common route filled with goofy slice-of-life antics, it effectively sets up the mystery fantasy setting and Yuma's role as what the localization calls a sorcerer, helping people across multiple worlds. Once you enter each heroine's route, the true emotional journey begins. Unfortunately, in the original Iroseka, the non-Shinku routes are pretty hit or miss in terms of quality. Most fans agree that Kana's route is the strongest, being the longest and featuring the most complete emotional arc, while routes for characters like Tsukasa and Kyo last less than a couple of hours each. However, the true route, starring Shinku, is by far the most popular one. This is where major mystery-like plot reveals occur and the setting and character relationships become far more complex than expected, with powerful emotional Nakige moments. While the game ends on a relatively satisfying note, it leaves plenty of open threads for a sequel. Thankfully, that sequel arrived in Japan just a year later with Irotoridori no Hikari, often nicknamed Irohika. Unlike the original, this release only has a fan translation made by Mei Tante Haru from 4chan, covering the original version, not the HD remaster from the 2020s. Irohika serves as the answer arcs to Iroseka's question arcs, resolving most of the original's hanging threads in great, if sometimes overly convoluted detail, which I'll discuss later. Despite including afterstories for all 5 original heroines, this isn't just a simple fandisk. Every heroine receives significant development tied to their character arc or the main story's themes. Standouts for me include Mio's afterstory, which offers a compelling redemption arc that parallels the true route of Irohika, and Kyo's afterstory, which is far better than her original route, featuring a proper plot and character arc involving a side character I wanted to see more of. Most notably, there's a flashback arc for Shinku's sister, Ai Nikaido, a personal favorite of mine. In the original, Ai was mostly a plot device with only brief glimpses into her motivations, but this flashback route shows how such an optimistic character functioned in an otherwise pessimistic world. The true route of Irohika, which is somewhat split into 2 parts and I won't spoil how, takes the emotional depth further, occasionally venturing into depressing Utsuge territory. This route fully lays out the complex world and character relationships while delivering memorable character arcs. That's as much as I can summarize about Irohika without spoilers. The one fandisk by Yukito Urushibara is Akai Hitomi ni Utsuru Sekai, which translates to The World Reflected in Her Red Eyes, Worlds End Love Will Last Forever, though people just call it Akaseka. This is a sequel to the true route of Irohika. You need to be a huge Shinku fan to fully enjoy this game, since this is basically light-hearted slice-of-life family and romance fluff with her and Yuma. Even though it has some light Urushibara melodrama here and there, and continues some of the smaller developments from Irohika, it ultimately is just a light-hearted fandisk, though most of the other main heroines appear enough for slice-of-life content. On a quick side note, there have been accusations, I think started by Nekonion staff, that the fanTL of Irohika and Akaseka used machine translation for these 2 games, but at least when I talked to Mei Tante Haru, the fan translator, he denied these claims, saying that he knows a good amount of spoken and written Japanese and just had to do a lot of dictionary lookups. Sakura Moyu as the Knights' Reincarnation, aka Yukito Urushibara's highest rated work to date, released in 2020 by Favorite, combines the essence of Irosekai and Irohika into a single complex visual novel, averaging over 60 hours of reading time. Unlike the Irotoridori series, it has no sequels or fandisks, a fan translation patch of the common route, with a translation for the rest of the game removed due to a cease and desist order from Nekonion, who by the way, they haven't released a single title after Iroseka due to it not selling enough, introduced its captivating Night Realm, a dark fantasy dimension where nightmares born from a psychological trauma, particularly suicidal thoughts, can drive their real-world selves to suicide. Protagonist Kanade Taiga, guided by his mentor Asahi, the Night Witch, enters this realm with occasional assistance from others, accessible only to those with high innocence or imagination, to subdue troubled souls manifesting as dolls. A lolly in a train suit, Nana, helps lay these souls to rest. 3 of the 4 main heroines, former magical girls from a decade ago and also the main character's childhood friends, add depth, In the common route, 2 can no longer enter the Night Realm due to implied lost innocence, while one of them, Haru, can enter again after requesting to be a magical girl again. I would say compared to the other Yukito visual novels I've read, SakuMoyu easily got me the most invested in its setting. Yukito Urushibara's most recent title is Perennial Dusk Kinsenka, released in 2025 with a full official English translation. By the way, I have to thank FrontWing for providing me a review copy, which partly inspired this video, as I prefer this kind of analysis over a standard visual novel review. In an interesting twist, this visual novel was developed by FrontWing, not Favorite, a company known for titles like the Grisaya series, Autry My Dear Moments, and Island. Kinsenka also features a different artist known for designing VTuber avatars, which sets it apart visually. I picked up Kinsenka because of Yukito Urushibara's involvement, but I was initially worried that as a kinetic, non-18+ eroge visual novel by a different company, it would feel very different from the Irotoridori and SakuMoyu series. Thankfully, within the first 30 minutes, that concern was dispelled. Despite the distinct art style, the setting feels like something Urushibara would create, consistent with his work over the past decade. The protagonist, Sai, a serial killer, which is a unique premise, gets drawn into what's called a Twilight Prison dimension, where memories of the deceased are stored, where characters can only view by getting a key from a penguin that can transform into a lolly. The main plot involves intense family drama centered around the heroine Matsuri Benio and her sister Tsui Benio, who have unique magical powers and split personality shadows that manifest based on the day of their mood. Unlike Favorite's previous visual novels, Kinsenka's end goal is revealed much earlier, with Sai quickly developing feelings for Matsuri and striving to protect her from her cunning sister Tsui. He allies with others who share similarly dark backgrounds and becomes one of several exorcists in this Twilight realm to deal with supernatural beings called Maledicts. Unlike the route-based structure of Urushibara's earlier works, Kinsenka is divided into 5 linear chapters, which could be an advantage or disadvantage depending on your perspective. Finally, there are a few single routes that Yukito wrote before the Iroseka series, like Kaden's route in Happy Margaret by Favorite, and Karameki's route in Gekka no Kirameki by Circle Mabius. However, considering these titles are very old and unlikely to ever be translated, I won't discuss them in detail, but I wanted to ensure I mentioned his entire catalog. According to MyAnimeList and AniiList, he's also done several manga and light novels, all of which I have not read. However, most notably, he's done a light novel called Irotoridori no Mirai, which is apparently a true sequel to Irohika, and is not the same story as the fantastic Akaseka. I definitely want to read this one once I learn enough Japanese. Now that I've briefly summarized the premise of Yukito Urushibara's visual novels, let's dive into what I consider the top 3 strengths and weaknesses of his scenario writing style. His first major strength is the ability to create incredibly interesting fantasy settings. Ultimately, the core of his stories is more personal and psychological, delving deeply into characters' pasts and issues. But it's the unique fantasy worlds that really draw me into the story, as I like how the fantasy elements are introduced early on, unlike key visual novel works, where the supernatural is usually built into the background until the writer requires it to resolve the depressing melodrama later. For example, the sorcerer elements in Irosekai add a layer of dynamism to the common route, instead of just being a typical bland high school moege common route with bad comedy. I would say the best setting of Urushibara's works that I've read is SakuMoyu's, with the whole Night Realm alternate universe that appears at nighttime. In addition to its creative yet intense dark fights, the Night Realm even has this whole train system where you can send spirits off and even grant wishes of souls that aren't quite in a bad state yet, helping them reach a higher state by forming skills to help their real selves in the real world. SakuMoyu is literally a world where almost anything can happen as long as you can imagine it, which makes the open-endedness quite interesting and unpredictable. Finally, the Twilight Realm in Kinsenka, revolving around shadows and storing people's memories, adds extra intrigue alongside learning about the unique Maledicts and other complex characters we're exploring. His next major strength I want to highlight is him excelling in using long, detailed flashbacks to humanize characters and set the stage for deeply moving emotional climaxes. These flashbacks delve into psychological and often extreme situations, such as child neglect, abuse, bullying, or isolation, that feels personal and relatable, fostering empathy and attachment. For example, in Irotoridori no Sekai, Haku's backstory about creating her child Ren and her tragic relationship with Ren's father vividly portrays her mental state, explaining her present behavior. Similarly, in Perennial Dusk Kinsenka, Chapter 1's flashback reveal Matsuri's shocking abuse and her shadow Nobody, with mystery-like reveals that integrate seamlessly into the story, showcasing her resilience. These flashbacks directly tie into powerful emotional conclusions, such as Mio's after story in Irotoridori no Hikari, where a character's redemption arc delivers a heartfelt ending aligned with the story's themes, or Kinsenka's chapter endings, which balance wholesome and depressing moments. Yukito avoids contrived resolutions, ensuring high-stakes scenes feel earned through careful buildup of character motivations, resulting in emotional payoffs that resonate without being overly melodramatic. I have heard that Sakura Moyu's flashbacks are some of the longest yet, with apparently multiple flashbacks back-to-back, which, given the characters and setting that I know of the common route, I'm actually interested in now. His third standout strength is his emotional character arcs, often enhanced by flashbacks and emotional climaxes, but capable of standing alone. Kana in Irotoridori no Sekai and Hikari exemplifies this, evolving from a goofy, clumsy maid into a deeply inspiring figure through her mini-arc in the common route, her own route, a role in the true route, an after-story, and another mini-arc in Irohika. Her journey to overcome a fragile past is both touching and motivating. Similarly, in Perennial Dusk Kinsenka, Yozora, while far from my favorite heroine in that VN, had one of the better emotional developments in the visual novel due to how her flashback led to her emotionally growing up enough to become a proper adult figure for the main cast. Another pleasantly surprising example is Suzu, who shifts from an unlikable, immature bully in Iroseka to a character with a profoundly moving moment in Irohika. Her small but impactful arc, built on personal growth, rivals even major moments in the true route, demonstrating Yukito's ability to craft compelling, well-earned character development across his works. Sakura Moyu's common route didn't have any super big emotional moments, but some reviews I've seen say that a few of the heroine routes made them extremely emotional. Given how well I was hit by some of the feels in Irotoridori and Kinsenka, I'm excited to see if Sakura Moyu's emotional content can get me as well. Unfortunately, as much as I love Yukito's writing for these strengths, which keep me coming back to nearly all his works, there are some common and fair criticisms to address. The first is the most common critique against him. His writing tends to be incredibly verbose, repetitive, and often includes scenes that go on far longer than necessary. A good example is in Sakura Moyu's common route. Despite the intriguing magical girl setting and the night realm, you're still forced to sit through unnecessarily bland, unfunny slice-of-life scenes, but even when hanging out with actual likable characters like Asahi, the main character's mentor, she tends to over-explain things that could be conveyed in like 10 lines or fewer, and even during the engaging Night Realm stuff, I still have to be lectured about what the Night Realm is with the exact same explanation with slightly different wording multiple times. The common route could have easily been cut by 20 to 30%, if not half. This verbosity also extends to Yukito's insistence on repeating what he likes to consider deep philosophical catchphrases throughout the story. For example, in Irohika, he overuses the phrase, "the world is full of words," and the line, "I hated you," far too often. While these are meant to emphasize emotional significance, the repetition makes it feel like the audience is being treated like they have Alzheimer's, that they need multiple explanations of the same thing in a short time frame when 2 or 3 at most would have sufficed. In Perennial Dusk Kinsenka, the phrase, "the heart is just a vessel for pain," becomes similarly grating due to its frequent repetition, which leads to my next point. Hand in hand with Yukito's verbose philosophical sayings and slow slice-of-life pacing, he has a strong tendency to make characters endure excessive sadness, loneliness, pain, and suffering. I appreciate characters facing adversity when it's done in moderation and with purpose. Well-executed struggles can elevate a good characters to greatness, and Yukito's stories do have impactful moments, as I've noted earlier. However, when he repeats this approach across 5 visual novels in a row, even in the fandisc Akai Hitomi or Akaseka, which is noted to include suffering despite being a supposedly wholesome fandisc, it just feels excessive. He often reuses the same types of suffering, constant parental neglect, abandonment, and even physical or low-key sexual abuse in his eroge titles. For example, in Perennial Dusk Kinsenka, the sheer number of characters enduring parental neglect and physical or emotional abuse felt ridiculous. As said, adversity is valuable, but some situations were just so over the top that it's hard to take the characters' suffering seriously at times. After experiencing several of his titles, the repetitive themes of parental abuse and the divide between children and adults make me wonder if Yukito is projecting personal trauma into his stories or something. I'm simultaneously intrigued and hesitant to read Sakura Moyu's heroine routes, as I've heard the VN epitomizes his tendency to write prolonged suffering over 60+ hours. However, my biggest issue with Yukito, even more than the verbose prose and repetitive suffering, is his tendency to create settings that become ridiculously complex by the end of each series. This is unfortunate because conceptually I love the settings he creates. They add intrigue alongside slice-of-life character moments and early introduced magical drama, avoiding the last-minute miracle magic that visual novels by Key tend to do through their melodrama. However, this strength becomes a flaw when the complexity just spirals out of control. A perfect example is in Irotoridori no Hikari. As a sequel to Irotoridori no Sekai, it introduces a ridiculous number of complications related to characters' identities, especially with Yukito's fondness for reincarnation. A user on my visual novel Discord, Otherside Blue, created a literal flowchart explaining how many connections there are through the complexity by the end of the Irotoridori series. I've linked their website in the description for more details, but just note it's all in Japanese. I've heard SakuMoyu is twice as complex as Irohika, which makes me both intrigued and hesitant to read its heroine routes, as I said earlier. While I would say Perennial Dusk Kinsenka is thankfully the least complex VN he's written, and it's notably compared as a simplified SakuMoyu, there's a specific twist later on that just felt a tad too convenient and lightly explained with the excuse that it's just magic, I ain't gotta explain shit. Before I wrap up this video, since I basically focused more on the themes throughout all of Yukito Urushibara's visual novels, I figured I'd at least rank the visual novels by him that I've read up to this point from worst to best. In last place of the 5 titles I've read from Yukito is the fandisc of the Irotoridori series, Akaseka. While the fandisc has some nice fluffy romantic screen time and even some light character development for Yuma and Shinku, I didn't exactly buy into their romance based on the screen time they got before, so I wasn't super into this screen time as I'd like, even if the family-related slice-of-life content was kinda sweet. This being a lighthearted fandisc means it has a lot of the typical gag humor from the Irotoridori series, which I'm already extremely hit or miss on, mostly miss. The worst offender in this entry, specifically, is Urushibara bringing in a character who is arguably one of the most despicable, disgusting, quote-unquote villain characters from Irohika, and attempting to turn her into lame comic relief without real character development is probably the worst thing this writer has ever done that I can think of. At least my girl Ai had a very short but very sweet cameo. In 4th place is Urushibara's newest title, Perennial Dusk Kinsenka. This one is unfortunate because I believe it could have easily been the best to date due to it being by a different company, FrontWing, especially one that doesn't enforce extremely lame humor like Favorite. And it does get off to a really strong start with Matsuri and Nobody's flashback in Chapter 1. Sadly, things go downhill after that, and Kinsenka is heavily brought down by many flaws, including the writer going on a weird shock value, violence, and edginess phase in addition to his usual repetitive and bloated prose, the main protagonist, Sai Tachibana, being a serial killer, which ended up being a net negative for the plot and making me unable to take his redemption arc seriously. Sadly, most of the rest of the cast was incredibly either underutilized, disappointing, or outright obnoxiously annoying like Suyu. Honestly, if Nobody wasn't easily the best girl, having incredible charisma, personality, and by far the most memorable character development, I don't even know if I could say I liked Kinsenka. In 3rd place is SakuMoyu, which is kind of depressing considering I only just read the common route and it's beating a title that's both brand new and translated, so you would think would be the author's latest and greatest work. That said, SakuMoyu's common route was just fine. I wasn't a fan of the slice of life comedy, which sadly is just common now with both Favorite and Urushibara. I wasn't super into Chiwa and Hiyori in general, and I could feel the bloated, slow pacing even in the common route. However, some of the drama done through the Night Realm was pretty interesting. There's clearly a lot about the main character Taiga we don't know much about yet, and thankfully, as far as I know, he's not a serial killer, or at least he doesn't start the game as one or something similar. And I would say Haru and Kudo are likable enough and have interesting enough implied depth to make me interested in reading their routes. 2nd place is Irotoridori no Sekai or Irosekai, the first experience I had with this writer, and it certainly made a strong impression with a common route that brought some neat intrigue and what's probably my favorite non-true route in visual novels, Kana Minami, who easily has my favorite overall development among any of the visual novels by Yukito. While I think Shinku, as a love interest, is a little overrated, she's at least decently likable enough, and her route had enough emotional moments for it to stand out for me. I would also say Irosekai is the least flawed in terms of the writer Urushibara's reliance on repetitive prose and depression edginess. However, Iroseka had flaws like some god-awful humor in the common route, and Tsukasa and Kyo getting the short end of the stick as far as heroine routes, screen time, and development, both being super short to the point I wondered why the 2 heroines were even there. This overall makes the sequel, Irotoridori no Hikari or Irohika, my overall favorite from Yukito, slightly surpassing the original Irosekai. Sure, in some ways it's more flawed than Irosekai, where Urushibara started the trend of his repetitive philosophical sayings and going a bit too far on the extreme depression edginess, and the writing started to get a bit too bloated. However, Irohika did a much better job of having a way better balance of heroine routes, with every single afterstory of the non-Shinku routes having strong emotional endings and generally leaving a much stronger impact while also contributing to the lore of the series. We also get what is, in my opinion, the most underrated route in the whole series, the flashback of Shinku's sister, Ai, which, while the shortest route in the whole series, easily stands out as the best paced and one of the most emotional, with Ai becoming one of my favorite new visual novel heroines due to her incredibly charismatic, if quirky, starry-eyed, idealistic attitude in an otherwise pessimistic world. I do have issues with Shinku's afterstory and true route having a lot of the bloat and repetition of Urushibara's writing style, and the main character's redemption arc not being quite as satisfying as I'd hope, but the second half of the route specifically has some really strong emotional arcs that more than made up for the flaws, and had a lot of interesting reveals, even if some were a bit over the top in terms of being convoluted. And that wraps up my thoughts on analyzing the works of Yukito Urushibara. As much as I want to love this writer even more and consider him one of my top favorites, and I can see why many fans do, his writing flaws prevent me from rating any of his individual works higher than an 8 out of 10. They have amazing intrigue, interesting characters, powerful emotional moments, and strong character development, but the overly repetitive and verbose prose, arguably self-indulgent philosophical rants, and unnecessarily complex settings hold them back from being true masterpieces in my eyes. Yet, it's his compelling settings, characters, and emotional moments that keep me coming back despite these flaws. In a way, he's like the epitome of a flawed masterpiece just in scenario writer form. Between the themes he's covered in all his titles, from the importance of memories, identity, redemption, hope, recognizing self-worth, the struggles and desires of the human heart, and addressing the consequences of sacrifice, I'll likely look forward to and read whatever Yukito creates next.